Book 1 On the Knowledge of God the Creator. Contents. The first book treats of the knowledge of God the Creator. But this being chiefly manifested in the creation of man, man also is made the subject of discussion. Thus, the principal topics of the whole treatise are two: the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man. In the first chapters they are considered together. In the subsequent chapters, separately. Yet things are introduced which may be referred to, either or both. What respects the scripture and images may belong to the knowledge of God. What respects the formation of the world, the holy angels, and the devils, to the knowledge of man. And what respects the manner in which God governs the world, to both. On the first of these topics, the knowledge of God, this book shows, firstly, what kind of knowledge God himself requires. See chapter 2. Secondly, where it must be sought. See chapters 3 to 9 as follows. Point 1. Not in man, because though the human mind is naturally endued with it, yet it is extinguished, partly by ignorance, partly by wickedness. See chapters 3 to 4. Point 2. Nor in the structure of the world, because, though it shines there with the brightest evidence, testimonies of that kind, however plain, are through our stupidity wholly useless to us. See chapter 5. Point 3. But in the scripture. See chapters 6 to 9. Thirdly, what kind of a being God is. See chapter 10. Fourthly, the impiety of ascribing to God a visible form, with observations on the adoration and origin of images. See chapter 11. Fifthly, the reasonableness that God alone should be supremely worshipped. See chapter 12. Lastly, the unity of the divine essence and the distinction of three persons. See chapter 13. On the other of these topics, the knowledge of man, it contains, firstly, a dissertation on the creation of the world and on the good and evil angels, all which relate to man. See chapter 14. Secondly, proceeding to man himself, an examination of his nature and power. See chapter 15. But, in order to get a clearer illustration of the knowledge of God and man, the three remaining chapters treat of the government of all human actions and of the whole world, in opposition to fortune and fate, stating the pure doctrine and showing its use, and conclude with proving that, though God uses the agency of the wicked, he is pure from all pollution and chargeable with no blame. Chapter 1. The connection between the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. Firstly, true wisdom principally consists of two parts: the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. Which of these two branches of knowledge comes first, it is hard to determine. They are intimately bound together, for our very existence is nothing but a subsistence in God. We begin to discover God when we are plunged into misery. Our poverty and woes, caused by Adam's sin, compel us to seek God's help. This is the first step towards knowing God. Our poverty, infirmity, and depravity lead us to perceive and acknowledge that God is all strength, wisdom, goodness. Through our imperfections, we are made to realize his perfections. A self-complacent man, content with his own endowment, but blind to his wretched condition, does not aspire to God. Secondly, when we are self-satisfied in our own goodness, by a natural proneness to hypocrisy, and compare ourselves with our neighbors, we tend to think ourselves holy and righteous. We judge ourselves by our own standards. Such judgment is as erroneous as by those who, being accustomed to seeing nothing but black, would call brown white. Such judgment is like the false confidence one has in one's eyes, who is accustomed merely to an earthward vision until dazzled by the noonday sun. Thus, being satisfied with our own goodness, we flatter ourselves. We fancy we are demigods. A true vision of God and his perfections, however, casts us flat to the ground. We begin then to see our hypocritical righteousness and loathe it as the greatest iniquity. Thirdly, the Bible consistently records the awe that overwhelms the souls of saints upon every discovery of God's presence. We shall surely die because we have seen God. See Judges chapter 13, verse 22. I am but dust and ashes. See Genesis chapter 18, verse 27. Are some of the expressions of the patriarchs who saw God. Judges chapter 13, verse 22 says, And Manoah said unto his wife, We shall surely die, because we have seen God. Genesis chapter 18, verse 27 says, And Abraham answered and said, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Elijah wrapped his face in his mantle, see 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 13, as he came into the presence of the Almighty. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 13 says, And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and went out, and stood in the entering in of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him, and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? In showing up man's pollution and impotence, Job brings him to the presence of the divine purity, power, and wisdom. Thus we perceive man knows not his own meanness, until he comes into God's majesty. Not only man becomes humbled before God, the cherubim, in holy awe, veil their faces too. See Isaiah chapter 6, verse 2. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 2 says, Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. Isaiah indeed puts down the whole universe under his feet. The moon shall be confounded, and the sun ashamed, when the Lord of hosts shall reign. See Isaiah chapter 24, verse 23. Isaiah chapter 24, verse 23 says, Then the moon shall be confounded, and the sun ashamed, when the Lord of hosts shall reign in Mount Zion, and in Jerusalem, and before his ancients gloriously. In conclusion, we see that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves are intimately connected. The proper order of instruction requires this, however, to treat the subject of the knowledge of God first. Chapter 2. The nature and tendency of the knowledge of God. Firstly, by the knowledge of God is not meant merely a notion that there is such a being. The knowledge of God should tend to bring us into pious and religious communication with God. We perceive in such a relationship a twofold knowledge. A. Of him as author of salvation and Redeemer through the person of Jesus Christ. B. Of him as Creator. In this preliminary study, we shall see what our knowledge of God as Creator results, as we discover him to be not only Creator of the universe, but also its provider and governor, with infinite power, wisdom, and goodness, and that he rules over the affairs of men, with righteousness and judgment. We should give him our worship. This knowledge should tend to lead us into a life entirely dependent on him, the fountain of all goodness. This knowledge should tend to produce a life of constant communion with him, in supplication and thanksgiving. In short, we should have a reverential love of God, arising from such a knowledge. For, till men come to such enlightened senses that they owe everything to God, in life and death, in great and small, they will not voluntarily serve him. Secondly, cold speculations merely on the essence of God, without warm understanding of God's benign character, whatever they may be, are therefore refuted. For example, there is the doctrine of Epicurus, of a God not concerned about the world, who remains in a state of perpetual inactivity as if he went to sleep. What benefit to mankind does such doctrine bring? Our knowledge of God should rather inspire fear and reverence, reliance upon his loving care, with rendering of thanks and praise. Our knowledge of God should inspire a personal devotion and submission to his rule and authority. Our knowledge of God should lead us to revere him as judge, rewarding the pious and punishing the wicked. We should therefore restrain ourselves from sin, not merely from a dread of vengeance, but rather from loving consecration. Because we love him as our Father and Lord, even though there were no hell, we would shudder at the thought of offending him. We fear not so much his hurting us, as our hurting him. We give him, as a result of such enlightened knowledge, heart worship, which is that pure religion so hard to find. For what we see mostly in worship is formality and great ostentation in ceremonies. Chapter 3. The human mind naturally endued with the knowledge of God. Firstly, without controversy, the human mind is naturally endued with the knowledge of God. According to Romans chapter 1 verse 20, God the Creator has given to all some knowledge of his existence through the things he has made. Romans chapter 1 verse 20 says, "For the invisible things of him, from the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." Cicero observes that there is no nation so barbarous, no race so savage, as not to be firmly persuaded of the being of God. Such knowledge should induce men to worship God and consecrate their lives to his service. Thus those who are endued with such knowledge, but do not serve him, are condemned by their own testimony. That man is naturally endued with the knowledge of God is amply proved by the retention of some religious sense in the most barbarous, who, in other aspects, appear to differ little from brutes. That man is naturally endued with the knowledge of God is also amply proved by idolatry. Though a corrupted form of worship of the deity, it nevertheless evinces a strong impression of the knowledge of God upon the human mind. Secondly, it is, therefore, a most absurd assertion that religion was the invention of a few cunning men, a political machine to confine the common people to their duty, while these inventors of religion disbelieve the existence of God. It is true that cunning men have introduced many inventions into religion to overawe the simple, that they might control their minds. But such craftiness could not have been practiced if the minds of men had not previously been possessed with a firm persuasion of the existence of God. Under such circumstances, it is incredible to say that the cunning minds who have used religion for their own ends are themselves devoid of any knowledge of God. The case of Caligula should prove our diagnosis. The Roman emperor was notorious for his audacious contempt of the deity. Yet no man trembled with greater distress at any occasion of divine judgment, for he became ultimately fearful of the divine power, whom he earlier despised. This phenomenon of fear of the Almighty by the ungodly must be traced to God's vengeance, smiting their consciences the more as they seek to fly away from him. These hauntings from God upon the harassed consciences of the impious is further proof that the idea of God is never lost in the human mind. Thirdly, by way of recapitulation, the idea of God impressed on the human mind is indelible. This, it has been observed, is evidenced by the futile struggle of the wicked mind to rid itself of it. Thus, Dionysius's scoff at the judgment of heaven is but forced laughter, while the worm of a guilty conscience gnaws within. I therefore cannot agree with Cicero that religion is getting better and better, for the world, as we shall soon discover, uses every method to corrupt this worship. The knowledge of God, far from being learnt in the schools, is self-taught from birth. Nature permits no one to forget it. Now the knowledge of God that we should have is, we are born to know him, and live for him. Unless our understanding has reached this point, it is uncertain and useless. This truth is reflected in Plato's teaching, that the chief good of the soul consists in similitude to God, when the soul, having a clear knowledge of him, is wholly transformed into his likeness. The knowledge of God that induces men to worship the Creator is what renders men superior to beasts. It makes them aspire to immortality.
If you would like to follow the rest of this series, please hit the subscribe button. If you enjoyed our content, please support us by liking, sharing, and leaving us a positive review on our channel.